The timeline is already cracking, and nobody in Oregon even realizes it yet. Something happened at the end of Wicked Wonderland that fans are only now beginning to connect. And if this theory is actually true, Descendants 6 won't simply continue the story. It could completely change everything we thought we knew about Red, Chloe, and even the Isle of the Lost. So stay until the end, because this twist could be much bigger than anyone expected. Descendants, Wicked Wonderland took fans on a wild journey through a fractured past, but its ending left one massive question hanging in the air. Why is the timeline starting to break apart? When Red and Chloe traveled through time to fix their mistakes, they believed that returning to the present would simply restore everything to normal. But there's one problem. Time doesn't work like a light switch. You can't simply turn it off, make a few changes, and switch it back on without consequences. Every version of Wonderland, Oregon, and the Isle of the Lost they interacted with during their journey could have left behind a mark. And marks like that don't simply disappear. Fans on social media have already started referring to this idea as the ripple effect, the theory that even tiny changes made in the past can slowly spread forward and alter the present. And if that theory turns out to be correct, Descendants 6 could be the movie where those ripples finally catch up with Red and Chloe. But why does that matter so much? Because Red isn't just another character in this universe. She is the daughter of the Queen of Hearts, and her entire identity is connected to a very specific version of Wonderland's history. If Red and Chloe changed even one seemingly insignificant detail in the past, what if the Queen of Hearts we know today isn't the same Queen of Hearts who was originally meant to exist? For Red, that possibility is terrifying. Her relationship with her mother, her personal journey, and even her attempt to become good instead of wicked could all be built on a timeline that is no longer stable. And some fans believe that could be exactly why Disney has remained so quiet about a sixth movie. Maybe they aren't simply deciding whether audiences want more Descendants. Maybe they're figuring out how to tell a story about a collapsing timeline without confusing viewers who simply want the colorful villains, catchy songs, and fun adventure they love. But that's where things get even more interesting. Because most fans probably expect Descendants 6 to follow the familiar formula. A new villain. A new song. A new lesson. And, eventually, everyone goes home happy, ***. But what if that isn't what happens? What if Descendants 6 isn't about defeating a villain who is coming for Oregon, but about dealing with a villain who was never supposed to exist in the first place? Think about what happened during Red and Chloe's time travel journey. They encountered different versions of characters, different choices, and completely different outcomes. But what if one of those alternate versions didn't disappear when the timeline was supposedly repaired? What if one version of a character, or even a version of Red herself, was left behind? And what if that forgotten timeline is now bleeding back into the main story? Suddenly, the phrase timeline breaking becomes much more than a dramatic theory. Because this wouldn't simply be a villain problem anymore. It would be a problem with reality itself. Multiple versions of history could be splitting apart and existing at the same time. And that brings us to Maddox Hatter. Maddox was introduced in Wicked Wonderland as a dangerous new adversary. At first, he appeared to be another obstacle standing in Red and Chloe's way. But some fans believe Maddox may not actually be gone. Villains in this universe rarely disappear for good. They have a habit of returning, often stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than before. So if Descendants 6 really does explore a collapsing timeline, Maddox Hatter could return. But not as the same villain we remember. He could return as a completely different version of himself, one shaped by a timeline Red and Chloe never intended to create. And that would make him more dangerous than ever. Because this time, he might remember everything. Even the parts of history that everyone else has forgotten. And that's where Red's family secrets could become incredibly important. Because we already know that Red's father, the King of Hearts, could have a much larger role in future storylines. Wicked Wonderland hinted at unresolved tension within Red's family history. And if the timeline really is unstable, the King of Hearts could be right at the center of it. Some fans are even speculating that choices from his past, choices that were never fully explained, could be connected to why the timeline began breaking in the first place. If that's true, Descendants May 6th not just be another adventure. It could force Red to confront painful truths about her own father. Truths that may have been hidden from her specifically to protect her from a broken past. Imagine discovering that the safe, stable world you grew up in was only stable because someone had been secretly holding the timeline together. And now, that protection is beginning to fail. But Red isn't the only one who could be affected. Chloe could be pulled into this disaster too. As Cinderella's daughter, Chloe represents a completely different kind of story, one built around hope, fairness, and second chances. But what happens when the timeline begins rewriting those very things? If different versions of history start colliding with the present, Chloe could be forced to confront a version of her own story where everything went wrong. Think about that for a second. What if Cinderella never got her happy ending? What if there is another timeline where Cinderella became bitter, broken, or trapped in the exact cycle of suffering that the original story was supposed to end? And what if Chloe is forced to meet that version of her own mother? That kind of twist would hit incredibly hard. Because it wouldn't just threaten Chloe's world. It would challenge everything she believes about fairness, destiny, and second chances. And that could explain why fans expect Descendants 6 to feel darker and far more emotionally complex than the movies that came before it. But now, things get even more interesting. Because there's another character whose existence could become a major part of this timeline mystery. Pink. Red's new sister was introduced as a fresh addition to this expanding universe, and at first, many fans assumed she was simply there to bring more energy, personality, and songs into the story. But if the timeline really is unstable, Pink's existence creates one huge question. Was Pink always supposed to exist? Or did she only come into existence because of the changes Red and Chloe made while traveling through time? That possibility changes everything. Because if Pink is the result of a timeline that was never supposed to exist, then her future could be connected directly to whether that timeline survives. And that makes her role in Descendants 6 potentially heartbreaking. Imagine Red discovering that completely repairing the timeline could mean losing her own sister. Someone she has already grown close to. Someone who, from Red's perspective, is real and important. Now Red would have to make an impossible choice. Save the timeline, or save Pink. That is the kind of emotional gut punch that could transform a fun family adventure into a truly unforgettable finale. And this may be one reason the phrase Descendants 6 Explained keeps appearing in fan discussions surrounding Wicked Wonderland. Fans aren't simply asking what happens next anymore. They're trying to understand why the story suddenly feels so much bigger than it did before. What started as a fun journey through Wonderland may have opened a door connecting directly to the Isle of the Lost. And through that connection, old villains, forgotten timelines, and unresolved consequences could begin leaking into the peaceful world of Auradon. If that theory is correct, Descendants 6 wouldn't simply be about stopping one villain. It would be about repairing reality itself before it completely falls apart. And that would raise the stakes higher than anything this franchise has attempted before. But there's another detail fans can't ignore. The timing. There was a 2-year gap between the rise of Red in 2024 and Wicked Wonderland in 2026. Because of that, some fans expect Descendants 6 to follow a similar pattern. That could mean filming potentially beginning in early 2027, with a possible release window around July 2028. Of course, this remains speculation. But if Disney really is planning to continue, and potentially end, this time-traveling trilogy with a story of this scale, the extra time would make sense. Because a story involving broken timelines, hidden family secrets, and alternate versions of beloved characters isn't something you can simply rush. Disney knows how emotionally invested fans have become in Red, Chloe, and their growing group of friends. So if Descendants 6 really is the finale of this arc, fans will expect it to feel earned, dramatic, and satisfying. Not like something rushed just to meet a release date. And then there's one more clue that could make this entire theory even more interesting. The possible title. And then there's one more clue that could make this entire theory even more interesting. The possible title. If Descendants 6 ends up being called something like Echoes of the Isle, that title alone could support the entire timeline theory. Because an echo isn't the original sound. It's a delayed, distorted repetition of something that already happened. And if the movie really were called Echoes of the Isle, it could strongly suggest that events from the Isle of the Lost, events connected to old villains, old choices, and forgotten timelines, are finally echoing into the present. Which would mean Red and Chloe wouldn't be facing a completely new threat in the traditional sense. They would be facing something much more dangerous. The consequences of choices they already made. Choices that seemed finished. Choices they thought they had erased. But choices that are only now beginning to catch up with them. So what would the final battle actually look like in a story like this? It probably wouldn't be a simple showdown between the heroes and one obvious villain. Instead, Descendants 6 could show multiple versions of reality crashing into each other. Old villains from the Isle of the Lost could return in forms nobody expects, changed and twisted by the timeline alterations. Familiar characters could suddenly appear behaving completely differently from how fans remember them. And that wouldn't just confuse the audience. It would confuse Red and Chloe too. Because they would have to answer one terrifying question. Which version of history is actually the one worth saving? That kind of storytelling would push the franchise into much more complicated territory. It could still have the colorful musical energy and fun that fans love, but underneath all of that would be genuine emotional stakes. Questions about identity. Questions about family. And ultimately, questions about whether changing the past is really worth the price. Because by the end, the entire movie could come down to one central lesson. A lesson that has been hinted at throughout the earlier films, but could finally be explored on a much deeper level. Red, Chloe, Pink, and their friends may have to accept something incredibly difficult. They cannot keep changing the past every time something feels unfair or incomplete. Every version of history comes with pain. But those painful moments also contain pieces of who they became. Even the parts they wish they could erase. And if they try to create a perfect future by deleting everything they consider painful or wrong, they could accidentally destroy the very relationships, family bonds, and personal growth that made their journey meaningful in the first place. That would give the trilogy a much more emotional ending. Not one built around simply defeating another villain, but around growth, sacrifice, and accepting the consequences of your choices. And if this entire theory actually turns out to be true, Descendants 6 won't just be another sequel. It could become the movie that completely redefines what fans thought they understood about this universe. Because the timeline breaking wouldn't just be a dramatic phrase used to describe the story. It could actually be the heart of the entire movie. It could explain why Red and Chloe's story isn't finished yet. And it could be the reason so many fans believe this saga is building toward its biggest, most emotional, and highest stakes chapter yet. So for now, keep watching for updates. Keep sharing your own theories. And if you want to be here the moment official news finally drops, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because if this theory is right, the next chapter of the Descendants universe could change everything.